And this is what organizations will do. Whatever we did with that person is exactly what we should do for the next people. And if I could say a big piece of advice, you cannot make a uniform hiring structure for all positions.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Baktari MD. As you know, season 2, we are going to be talking about Crash CEO School. Basically, what is it that you need to know if you're starting a company, if it's just you and your spouse, if you already have a company, if you're 2 years, 3 years into your journey, wherever you are, what lessons do you not have to make that you can learn from other people so you can improve your learning curve and get your company or organization to where it should be. So in that endeavor, I have an amazing guest, Megan Couch, who is the Chief Experience Officer for Integrity Staffing Solutions. And she has been on an amazing journey for 22 years with the company. In the past, she's had positions in recruiting, high volume accounts, on-site management, and vice president of human capital strategies before becoming their chief experience officer. And before I bring Megan on, I just want to tell you I've had an opportunity to meet with Megan, and I think she brings a lot of insight into hiring, recruiting, processes, things that, when you're starting a company, you just take for granted. You're like, well, okay, we'll grow our company and we'll just get more people. And there's a whole science behind that. And this is why I'm so honored to have Megan with us, because what I'd like to do in this episode is basically walk through with her things that you will need to know one way or another if you're going to start a company, grow a company, in terms of how to get people, how to enroll them into your vision, what to look for, what not to look for, and what are the best practices, what are the processes. And I think Megan is sort of the Michael Jordan of that with her wealth of experience. So with that, Megan Couch, Megan, welcome to the show. Welcome to Baktari MD.
Thank you so much for having me. That's quite a talk up. I know. I hope I
Yeah.
deliver.
I have no doubt. I've already pre-talked to you even, and you're amazing. I wish I had even a tenth of your knowledge before I started any companies.
Mm.
Yeah, it's like, so, I think we were talking before the show, our goal here, and, I think it's going to be a very casual conversation, is, why make all these mistakes? Like, if you could go into a time machine right now and go speak to Megan 22 years ago, I mean, you probably hit her over the head with a bat and say,
Right.
don't do this. So there's really broadly speaking, your journey. Tell us a little bit about it, and then we'll get into and also tell us about integrity solutions, staffing solutions, and then let's talk about some of the nitty gritty. But go ahead.
Well, first, I think I would tell that Megan, don't get that haircut. Like, just no bangs, just no bangs. Like, we don't need to bring them back.
Yeah. Well,
But
luckily there was no social media back then, so we can't
thank
find those pictures.
goodness. Oh, thank goodness. But I think I had that big bag phone, to start with, and maybe a
Oh
pager, and I
no.
was really excited about it.
Oh no.
If I could go back and say, like, what are some things, especially kind of top line of what I knew then, is that, I mean, you have to think when we were interviewing folks, I'd started out as a recruiter, and I started out as an on-site recruiter for our organization. We're 25 years old, Integrity Staffing Solutions is. We specialize in a lot of, I'd say, high volume e-commerce clients, ones that I think anybody can think of just off the top of your head. And we learned, I would say, the hard way on how to do specific processes. And if I could visit her now, she would probably still be going through a 25-page paper application, with folks that really don't want to be there filling out a 25-page application. We have completely other departments for compliance just to check the 25-page application. We have a testing center for them to do a test to be able to see if they can perform on the job, all these different pieces. And we're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 folks that have to do this in a really short period of time.
Right.
So
Well,
I would have
but
said,
yeah, go ahead.
look at the process first. Like, where is the way to combine this? What are the absolute requirements? Like, I know everyone has to fill out an I-9. I know everyone is going to have to fill out a W-4, but are there other items really that important? And the questions that you're asking, like,
Mm,
what answer can somebody give that would disqualify them? Really, if you go through it all, because there's thousands of people filling it out, and I can tell you, we would take time with the interviews, but if somebody had a reasonable explanation of how they're answering, that's fine. But
mm.
who in during that process is going to say, well, I'm going to miss work every other day, probably, you know? So,
Yeah, right. Yeah,
okay,
right.
so a process and just simplifying the actual experience. So the recruiters and the people that are applying are not, you're not wasting each other's time.
So I'm hearing big picture, set up a process, whether it's technology, whether it's the minimal amount of questions you need, make it something that's scalable, replicable, and
Yes.
doesn't give you brain damage and kind of getting a large volume of people. Well, maybe we should start up by telling your company does a lot of temporary staffing for companies that need seasonal help.
Yes.
And I think you said like 35% of your business is for permanent staffing.
Hmm.
So just really briefly talk about that seasonal thing. So a lot of e-commerce company, like you said, names we don't have
Yes.
to say, but everyone knows. When they have a seasonal rush in Q3 and Q4, they come to you and tell us what, how you handle it when they
Yes.
come to you.
Well, thankfully, we have a lot of long-term partners, and we learned, I think, a lot of lessons on how to plan to have people come into the building or different buildings. That's a whole other probably podcast of how you onboard folks and how you need to retain and what you actually need to tell them. But as far as the volume goes, you can look at the different business, I would say the different clients and their different business volumes and say they're going to be busier Q3 and Q4. Are they going to be busier during the holidays? Are they actually shipping products that are seasonal themselves? Are they increasing their toy lines? Are they decreasing certain portions? And especially if there's any type of grocery delivery, and usually if they're dependent on, I would say, a community, you can get very specific on what's actually going to increase or
Hmm.
not. So and you think about it, I say Q3, Q4, but then Q1, all these places have returns.
Right.
So you think, okay, there's a higher volume for returns. And so then you're already almost into Q2, and then
Right.
you start thinking of the plan to ramp back up for Q3 and Q4.
Yeah.
But be very specific. And it's not I would say, a peanut butter spread, like you just aggregate everything. It's very
Right.
specific to the client and what they are shipping.
Right. And like you said, some companies have different high seasons that may not be Q3,
Yes.
Q4. But let's also move to permanent staffing. You said you
Yeah.
guys have diversified, and I think you
Yes.
said about 35% of your business is permanent staffing. When you look at, and I think a lot of people watching this podcast may be at this stage more inclined towards permanent staffing, you had to come up with a different ground rules for permanent staffing than temporary staffing. How did you change the ground rules, when you were looking for someone that, you needed, for a couple of years or 5, 10, or you wanted to have them be there for 20 years and retire at the company? What did you have to do as a company to start looking at that process? And how
Hmm.
different is that?
So I'm going to say it's very client dependent. And my first piece of advice, and even when we onboard new clients for direct hire today, I ask if we can talk to their most recent hires. Like, are we
Mm,
able to talk to folks that have gone through their process, not ours, but their process? Because usually 90% of the time, the client will say, I want you to replicate our process. Like, we need folks, we need basically your labor. We need you to screen folks. We need you to do this, but they want it in a very specific way.
mhm.
So, but then we will definitely ask, okay, and it's very, I'd say, eye-opening to have them come back and say, here's the feedback from your recent hires. You know, like, so they went through 5 people. It took a month. There was different sections that they were sent to complete. And there's some very specific, I'd say specific based on role. If I were
Mhm.
hiring for an accountant, versus someone else or an administrative assistant or a general manager of a facility, all of those have different skill sets. So it does not make sense to have everybody complete the same exact thing.
Hmm.
So you can make a very specific model, but I'm not an expert at engineering.
Right.
And
So,
so we
so
go
do you
back and take their feedback.
do you limit it then to the people who would be apropos for their job? And also, do you have a maximum number of people, for example, that they should interview, or is company dependent?
It's role dependent because I can tell you if you're hiring for IT, and then there's very specific programming guidelines that folks want. And we don't live in that world every day, but I know that they need to have, certain certifications. So when we go through that, that's very different and specific. Then you add the testing elements where it's here, add the testing elements early on. Don't
Mhm.
wait until you've been through 10 people,
Right.
and then have them test afterward because potentially could have saved everyone a lot of different time.
Hmm.
And I think you need to establish with hiring managers, I see the biggest issue come up with the time that they have to get back to folks. That's the rub. And that's the one that makes everybody very, I would say, uneasy with the process. Because if you're going to take a month and we've sent you 40 candidates,
Hmm.
and you've only actually spoken, you'll say 25 are qualified, let's say. So that means they need to interview 25 people on top of us. And if there's not time for them to do that, and
Hmm.
it's taking them longer, unfortunately, they're not ready for that hire yet then. I mean, they'll say that they are, and I truly believe it. It's like no malicious intent, but then you have to identify the time up front that you're going to be able to take.
Yeah, well, which kind of leads me to a problem we see. Uh, from the time you actually interview someone, what would you say is the sweet spot that if you don't get back to them by this time, the slope is going down? Would you say a week, 2 weeks, a month? I mean, uh, I have found anecdotally, but you're the one with all the experience, is that if you find the right candidate, you got to really move fast,
Yes.
and not let the whole process go through. Now that can come back to bite you, but how do you deal with that? When companies come to you and say, we want to interview 10, 20 people, it's going to take us a month. We can't get back to the people we interview in the beginning until week 4, 5, 6. What do you say?
We will create and walk through a timeline that we'll revise for them. I would say sweet spot. If you know that you liked this person, this is usually what. Well, we want to see some other candidates, but I loved this person,
Hmm.
and our feedback is then hire this person because they're
Right.
not going to be here next week. I will say if you're going to go past a week and a half to 2 weeks, no. And if you know that you are, at least you can prep the person that you're interviewing to say this is going to be a 2-week hiring process.
Right.
And but we also say from the beginning, like put your game plan with specifics together. So if you're going to have a 4-person, I would say hiring interview, 4 people from the
Hmm.
org, then give us very specific times during the week in the same week or early the following that we can slot interviews all together.
Okay.
So schedule them out and not like, well,
Oh.
I'm going to have to talk to Dave now. Let me see what time Dave has. No, work it out from the get-go. It makes it go so much faster.
Meaning right there, schedule something else. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying if I'm the hiring manager and I need times, I need to provide the times to people to say, here are my blocks of times that you can schedule these interviews. And so it doesn't matter if they have,
Oh,
I
I
would say
see.
if it's 4 people, yeah, like so there, because the weight is really logistics of scheduling
You're talking
at
about
that
the
point.
playing phone tag with the person until they agree to do
Yes.
this thing. So it's saying,
Yes.
hey, I know you're giving me these 2 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm booking
Correct.
people for you, whether you like it or not. No, I get it
Correct.
though. No, no,
Hmm.
and that's really important. I think literally telling people, even if you're doing the first interview, saying, hey, Susie or Bill, we love everything so far. Need to have the director also meet you, and he or she is available next Tuesday, blah, 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 blah. And you're not, I'll get back to you. So that's really important. Okay. So I'm hiring you. Okay. I just
Hmm.
called you up and said, listen, I know we're small fish. We only have 30, 40 employees, but we want to hire you. And we want you to set up a process for us. Our process doesn't work. Um, we put the ad in whatever, I
Hmm.
don't know what you guys, ZipRecruiter, this, that, Indeed. We get the applications, we get the secondary questions that are there. Okay, they all showed up in our email box. Uh, you teach me how, as the pros, what is like the first 3 steps with that then?
Good question. So if I have, I'll give a hypothetical role. Let's just say a department manager. And
Hmm.
that's what it is. Um, I will automatically take what we posted as that job description, which is, let's just say it's Indeed, and do a quick overview to say, like, have they met these basic requirements?
Right.
Um, I would say at least 40% typically do not.
Hmm.
I'll kick them out just because they haven't met the very basic of what we're asking for. So that's usually step one, and you can do that
Uh,
rather quickly.
Could I interrupt and say,
Sure.
I know with some of those Indeed is that you're allowed to put like a deal killer questions like, do you type or what have you? When you throw them out, or you're not throwing them out just because of the resume. Sometimes you're throwing them out because they signed or they filled out those deal killer questions the wrong way. Like
True.
this is not a
Yeah.
remote, you know,
Geography, right? Non-remote
right?
position. Yes.
Yeah, and they live 40 miles away. It
Or
doesn't really
the
if it's not,
experience.
yeah,
Yeah, like a lot of that has to do with the experience that's required for the position, which I could
right.
talk a lot about too, because I
Okay.
think employers also need to look at a lot of employers will have a job description that they've had for probably 5 years. And it's the same job description, and you need to update it. And even to get more applicants, you need to update it because then you can refresh it on, for SEO optimization. You can do all those things to get more
Right.
folks from sourcing. But look at the criteria because it's very like,
Yeah.
do people need a college degree for certain positions that you're
Right.
hiring? More than likely not.
Right.
Do they need to have 4 years experience? Okay. And I think a lot of companies will say, but yeah, that's the person that we're looking for. But
Right.
if I can show them somebody that has 3 years experience, but might have some other skills,
Right.
fine, like move it to upskill them.
Yeah. Right.
But
What?
so yeah, when I'm kicking out, when I'm going through the first pass, it's literally, are they basic? Have they answered these questions? Okay. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like that
That that
takes that.
that that's a great tip because when Bill or Susie quits after 5 years at the company, the instinct from the CEO is, hey, put that ad back, the same ad we used to get Bill,
Yes.
put that one back up. But
Yes.
but Bill was here for 5 years.
Well, and Bill
His
probably,
role.
yeah, Bill probably did something that, benefited the organization where he could be like, all right, well, let's look at Bill's characteristics and what was outside of that scope. Like,
Right.
actually, and that's a good point because I say, like, we do a lot of after action reviews, whether it's good or bad. Like, did this hit the needle that we wanted? Or more than likely, it probably hit some other needle, okay, so what do we need to do now to pivot it? And so we do a lot of kind of what I was saying before. It's like, does this job description fit the bill? And I can tell, and a lot of other folks can tell. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is written in like old English. I don't think this has ever been, has ever been updated. And
Right.
it really depends now because there's a lot of algorithms, right?
Right.
So the keywords that are attached to it, like folks have to think about it when they put their resume together,
Right.
because recruiters can just go in and put certain keywords that they're looking for. And if it's not in there, it won't technically track.
Right. As long as you're talking about the description, do you think on balance it's better to overshoot the importance of the position than undershoot it? Because I see ads for like administrative clerk. Like how many people are waking up saying, I want to be administrative clerk? But and I think we have learned that, where you don't call it administrative clerk, you can say
Right.
assistant director to, or assistant to the director, or, because often that is what it really is. But we just call it literally like what they're be doing, but not how important they are. And tell us about like that job title
Yeah.
versus,
It's a great topic. Because I look at the job descriptions and I'd say guilty of it ourselves. If it's a basic title job description, we're like, how do we jazz that up? And
mm,
so even if it's production worker, people understand what a production worker is. It doesn't need to be like assistant to a lead in production, or
mhm.
something of that. We're trying to like sass it up a little bit. No, be as honest as possible. One of my pet
Okay.
peeves, I will say this, and not just mine, I think a lot of people's, is you think you have to keep like some type of secret within the job description. Like, ooh, let's get folks to look at it, and they'll look at it if we don't put a pay rate on there. Wrong. They're not looking if you don't put rates,
Mm,
at least a range,
right.
depending on what it is. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's no stick and carrot game, because
Yeah.
as an employer, you're the one like, what is the actual position that you're doing?
Right.
Just tell them.
Well, Well, but let me kind of give you a different perspective because I hear that from like if you're doing temp staffing or you're doing where you just need physical labor. But, if you have a creative startup where, you're literally, the person who's doing the scanning or answering the phone can be vice president of the company 10 years from
Hmm.
now because you're the only three people in the company. And I think what happens, at least for us when we were starting, every position, there were no filler positions in a smaller organization. So we actually, I think, did the opposite, where we underplayed how important their position could be, even if it was, a very minor role in theory. The flip side is I think we underplayed it. So I hear what you're saying, though. If it's a big operation and they're going to essentially be a cog in the wheel, let's be honest about it. But if the flip side is true, where the sky is the limit on where you can go, yeah, it doesn't matter where you get into the company. We're fresh and hungry, and we're like a startup, and doesn't you could come in as the janitor, and I'm exaggerating, but whatever.
Hmm.
The point is, yeah. But go ahead and so
I
depending on the company, but how do you deal with that?
I will say that so the soul of a startup is very different, right? Like
Mm,
we've been there, we've been with multiple organizations where, and it's not my verbiage. I stole it from somebody else. Like, but what is the soul of a startup, and how do you actually start staffing for that? Because everything is so. I mean, you're basically hiring for grit at that point, and then some specialization for later down the road, whatever
uh,
that may be. But I think also during those interview processes, I think folks have a very clear understanding of it's a startup means I don't know what you're going to be doing every day exactly, but it's going to be something, you know,
yeah,
so,
yeah.
and yeah, the sky's the limit. We don't have a 3 or 5 year plan other than like, we need to get, get more capital to make sure that we keep going or funding or what have you. So I think that is a different one. Like that's a different scenario completely. But I think the minute that you say, hey, we're a startup, folks would
Yeah,
probably understand that
right,
quickly.
right. Yeah, and even though like I think 10 years into our journey, I still think we're a startup because we still have that mentality. And but I think you brought up two important points. If it is a cog in the wheel and there's hundreds and hundreds of people, be honest. If there's
Hmm.
room for upward
Advancement.
mobility, be
Yep.
honest about that too, as best as you can, so people get it. So I hear, and I think as people are listening to this podcast, depending on where they are in their journey, how far along they are, whether do you really need to hire for grit, like you said, or do they need someone just to come in and knock the work out and try to convey that?
Because there are folks, I think, and we also kind of educate, I would like to say, with our clients, if there's not room for forward advancement, like
Mhm.
really don't push it. Don't try and fit a square peg into a round hole, right?
Right.
Because the people think, oh, well, maybe I'll become, let's say, an area manager, and then it's a regional manager, and then it's this. If they're not open positions or you don't see them being open within the next
Mm-hmm.
6 months to a year,
Mm-hmm.
then be honest about it. Because there
Got it.
are a lot of folks that actually just want to come in, do the work, and then leave.
Right.
That's fine. And that's just it's depending on where you need it to be, and it doesn't even need to be temporary, I would say, but there is, I would say, folks that are part of a lot of I see like finance departments where they have a very specialized skill, and they're like, this is what I want to do, and I don't want to be a controller. I don't want to move up. I want to
Right.
like this is the skill and the software that I know. This is where I want to stay. So just be honest about it when you are going through it. And I would say for higher salaried positions where you're not going to necessarily put that pay range,
Mm-hmm.
use that first conversation that they have with the organization. You should give the range because I
Really?
can't tell you how many times we've made it to fourth interview, fifth interview, and then all of a sudden they're like, well, I wanted this and it's something that's nowhere near where you knew you were going to pay for that position. So you've just wasted their time and your own time.
So what about asking for salary expectation as part of the application?
Yes. Well, depending on process, we'll have the conversation in the first conversation. That's part of our process. I would say, does that make sense? Like we will,
Well, but that means you're going to reach out to them, or you're going to have it as part of their secondary application. In other words, if you're
yep.
flipping through 100 resumes and the job pays 50, 75,000 a year,
Mhm.
and somebody says, I'm expecting, 750,000. There's no point. I mean, right. Or I'm exaggerating, but is that a fair thing to try to get up front?
Yes.
To, but not to
Yes.
waste their time and your time. But go ahead.
I'm adamant about yes, because I think as the adults going through the process, like, yes, we can put what an expected range is, but every person thinks, well, that's just a range. Like
Yeah.
I can talk them into something higher,
Right.
like
Yeah.
zero doubt. So then you get to the
Yeah.
next parts of the conversation, and you
Yeah.
don't want to have, I mean, if even if it's 4 hours of time invested and then it's 4 hours of their time
Right.
invested, where literally you could have the conversation up front, like, here's the expected salary range that we're willing to
Yeah.
pay. Uh, if I were the person on the other side, I would say, is there any room to make that move? You know,
Right.
up. If the answer is a definitive no, then it's a decision that you make right there. Okay,
Right.
thank you very much. We'll keep you in mind. Let me
Right.
know if
Right.
anything changes. Done.
Right. Right. It's interesting because we're confronted this well, a lot where we give a salary range and then somebody comes and says, well, you know, can I have, 20% more?
Yep.
And maybe I'll throw this out as one thing I learned. I say, you know what? I hear you, and you may be worth 20% more, or you may deserve 20% more. But why don't we do this? Why don't you come, you know, join the company, light the company on fire. And can you imagine at the end of year one, you've lit the company on fire and you come to us and say, I want 20% more. And we're going to say, no, we're not giving you 20%. I don't care. You lit the company on fire. You've been dialed in, all in. I mean, you above and beyond at every turn, but we're not going to give you that extra. So I always tell people, you know what, if you're 20% away, why don't you come in and light the place on fire and say, you know what? We get rid of Megan, we're going to have to hire 4 people to replace her. Not that she's working more than 40 hours a week, but oh my gosh, how can we replace Megan? And I don't know have you ever tried that? In other words, not to say no, simply say, well, come on in
Hmm.
and light the place on fire and, make us so we can't say no to you. Make it that we have to say, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to replace Megan? It's not working more than 40 hours a week, but those 40 hours, ah, I mean, she owns this company. And that what I have found, and maybe slightly different because we're more, we're more in the growth phase, but to let people know, come on in, we're just this far apart, light the place on fire. Let's talk, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the first alternate approach is what you're talking about, where it's
Mm,
okay. Like I'm not gonna go that high. But if you outperform over and above your job expectations, and basically kind of what you're saying is that you'll get it if you can show that you can save us more money. Like you're gonna make it up. That's basically kind of what you're saying, which I think it has a depending on the personality and what job you're interviewing for, could potentially work. I mean, if you look at sales positions, especially, like
mhm,
that would be something I think that is very you're already in the negotiation, right? But I think
mm,
for others, you have a budget.
right.
You don't know necessarily where, your company's going to come in at certain points. If you are seriously going to take and figure in that 20%, if he or she does really well, sure, that's an approach, but you're already negotiating even before you're
Yeah,
getting kind of on the team. So
right.
I think what we've seen, and I don't want to say, I mean, of course, I can give examples of where it's successful
Go
because I
ahead.
don't
Yeah,
want to,
yeah. I
I don't
like
want
this.
to, yeah, I don't want to dissuade people from taking that approach because I'm a firm believer in negotiate.
Hmm.
But what I'm not a firm believer of is really if you're that far apart
Right,
and now I'm already having to make up for it.
right,
So
right,
I think
right,
in certain aspects, like, yes, sales, if you're talking about commission structures, if you're talking about like something that way, that can work. If you're
right.
not,
Yeah, yeah. Which, by the way, you hit on a point that really is kind of one of my buttons. I remember negotiating with a potential new employee. This was like 5 years ago, and it was a six-figure offer, 110,000 to start. I won't go into what position, but so do all the interviews, send her the contract and do a final thing. And then uh, she had like three $500 questions. Like, will I get this $500 back for this? Or I won't get into it specifically. And I just thought, oh my gosh, so this person actually was a new grad, just getting out of school, had never done a day of work, and was getting offered $110,000. And they were trying to haggle over an extra $500. And I think maybe some new grads or new people think like, oh, I just have to haggle. But when you get 99% of what you want.
This is what you're describing, and I think it is very generational, I will say, because
Mhm,
I think as employers, we're like, well, we're giving you this great opportunity, like, and now you're going to argue about the like pennies to the dollar of what this actually is. And there's an automatic feeling of like, "Ugh, why would they do that?" But they're coming from a structure or not structure of,
mhm,
well, I can't pay that. So of course I would ask them if they can pay that, and absolutely think nothing is wrong. Right? Like, they're
mhm,
thinking, "Okay, well," and especially, where folks come in personality-wise and what you're hiring for. Like, if you're
mhm,
hiring that person in finance or any
mhm,
type of, I would say, position that has to do with accurate record keeping or anything like that, I would be like, "I'm so happy that person's asking this question about these small $500.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
not petty." But if you've been going through a process where you've been pretty clear from the beginning, and then if your gut tells you is this person's gonna be like this the whole time, like they're gonna focus on what they're doing versus what they actually need to be doing, your
right,
gut's probably right. I
right,
think it
right.
really depends on what you were hiring for.
Yeah, and I think that that's an opportunity instead of asking about the $500 to tell you how they're going to light the place on fire and how they're going to make an impact. But I think those are, I mean, we're giving advice to companies, but that's advice for people looking for a position. If you got 99% of what you wanted, get the other 1-2% by killing it.
Yes.
And actually you'll get much more than 1-2% because I've never seen someone let someone go because of salary demands when it's going to take four people to replace them. Right.
And you're right. Yeah, so it's if someone comes in, and those are the best, that
Mm,
literally do light the world on fire, and by the
mm,
end of it, you're like, "That's one of the best hires that we've ever had." And this is what organizations will do. Whatever we did with that person is exactly what we should do for the next people. And
mm,
if I could say a big piece of advice, you cannot make a uniform hiring structure for all positions.
mm,
Like-minded positions, yes, but
mm,
not all positions. You will have the same basic questions for, I would say, 50% of it, but
mm,
especially if it's in a specialized role or a higher level role, you're going to have some changes to it, right? Like I'm not going to ask somebody that would be an area sales director what kind of accounting background they have. Like that's just very simple,
mm.
stupid, right?
Right.
And uh, I'm a firm believer in, hey, let's not ask these dumb questions. You know what I mean? Like I can see the information that you input. And it's kind of
Right.
like what I said in the beginning, where folks have the same application that still has how many days of work have you missed in the past 6 months? Well, if I'm asking a higher level salaried employee that question, I look like an idiot.
Hmm.
And again, 99% of the people never say, oh, I missed 10. Like, oh, by the way, yeah, I wasn't very good at coming to work. Or
Okay. Okay. Well, then, you and I talked about this a week or two ago. So I think I brought you on, I think just for this conversation we're about to have right now. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, the interview between, business and an applicant is the most artificial thing you could ever imagine. Nothing is more artificial than that. It's like going on a first date and, telling the person you snore. It's just not going to happen.
yes.
And I think it works both ways. I think the business is going to say what's going to make them look good, and they're not going to talk about any issues in the business and what have you. And everybody loves working there. You should be so lucky you're even here to get an interview. And so I think they distort it that way. And then the applicant says, "Hmm, what does Megan want to hear from me so I can get this job?" Okay, so whatever you ask, I think is filtered by what is the correct answer, not necessarily what is the truth. So you've done this for a long time. I think you and I talked about
Hmm.
it, but Okay, what do you do? I mean, what's the point of saying, are you committed? Is this going to be a career? Are you all in?
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Right, right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, how do you find out that they're running this massive Amazon business out of their garage and that's the focus of their lives?
that's so
or,
true.
or how do you find out that they've just started pre-law and they're going to be leaving you in a year? How do you get all of that information? Because they're not going to put that in the resume. So this is a very artificial dance. I'm dying to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so this is situational. Like we ask questions, I think that are more, and I hate it's kind of a catchphrase, behavioral based, but to kind of see what folks do in the position, and when I'll give you an example, and there's a lot of companies with a lot of books and a million different answers to this question from other recruiters, where I'd say a good portion are still going through the tell me about your attendance and tell me about the last time XXX happened,
Yeah, yeah.
where I'm like, whoever says crappy thing, it's my favorite depending on the interview when they give an honest answer. And you're like, you know what? That was a horrible answer, but it was the truth. Like I could
Right.
tell, like, it was immediate. They gave it. I give more points for that than the person. And please, everyone, don't say that you have nothing to work on. That is a pet, like, no. Like, is there
but
anything that
but
you like might be able to improve upon?
yeah,
So
but don't they turn that into a positive too? The thing I need to
Mhm.
improve on is I work too hard and
Yes,
I take
that kind of
occasion.
answer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
so even when you ask something like that, do you get anything?
I do. So it's kind of like filter for the truth and the gut reaction because I love it when folks are like, my time management. Yeah, I really need to work on it because
Hmm.
I don't do the best job of managing like between the meetings, between the work, and between this. I think it's a very old school mentality where folks were like, oh, they said that they had to improve on something. Well, of
Hmm.
course they did, because we
Hmm.
all do. But that that question, and it still isn't my favorite, but I think it's a valid question to ask to see what answer you're going to get. But we will give folks, before they get to a certain interview or an interviewer, we will give them examples. And I would say, even of like, can you provide us a case study? If you're talking about higher level, like, can you provide us a case study with the following examples of how you impacted a process?
Hmm.
Please explain how you implemented that change, and
Hmm.
please like, be specific as possible. I
Yeah,
fully well know with some of the ones that come back, I'm like, well, this isn't that person.
right.
Like they use somebody else's example.
Ah,
Like
it,
that's the other one. You have to
it,
talk to them about their case study, and if
ah,
they don't know the details to that, you know that they went on Google and they were like,
ah,
"Case study for this," and
ah.
inserted notes. So a lot of folks don't even get past that,
Wow.
because you wanna talk what it's whatever they provided.
That's a great. So you because they can't give the excruciating details of something that never happened, is what you're
Right.
saying, right? They can't
Yeah,
because
well,
yeah.
I mean, a great example, we had a gentleman, and this was probably just a couple years ago, and he provided a Six Sigma Lean example. And even I'm not certified in Six Sigma. I mean, I know what it is. I know, again, I know a lot about a little, but enough to, I was like, walk me through the case study. Like, what did you learn from the principles using like this lean program? And it was almost a deer in headlights. And he's like, well,
Wow.
let's move on to, he's like, I provided another one in another section, like another, request. There was multiple case studies, but I was like, no, I want to talk about this one. And to the
Wow.
point that it was just awkward and we ended the interview.
Mm. Now, okay, so I got so many things for you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
let's say you're in the interview and something like that happens where you're like, but isn't it odd to say, well, thank you very much. That was great, but we're moving. I mean, don't you feel like a need to go on for another 10 minutes, even once you've
No.
decided? You will
No.
just cut it off.
You you will get a different answer from how other people interview. But for me,
Yeah.
no, there's no need to continue.
Okay, so
There
I'll give
really
you.
isn't.
Okay, so
It might be like the people don't wanna get into an awkward type of situation, so I totally understand that. You can go on for another 5 to 10 minutes, but what's the point when you've already
okay,
established,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I will ask, like, "Is there any other
yeah,
information that you can provide that would make me feel more comfortable that you actually did this?" Like,
yeah, yeah.
this isn't a trick,
Right,
so
right,
just tell, and then got to the point where he just admitted that that wasn't his information. No,
right.
we don't need to continue.
Wow. So again, I throw one of my anecdotes in here. I remember we were interviewing for a marketing position, and we have a CRM, so it's a lot of typing involved, and the marketing position, and so we really look at typing speed as a
Yeah.
crucial part of the job. So got this applicant 95 words per minute.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, wow, okay. And then had a good, somewhat of a good resume. And before the interview starts, we have him take a typing test. Okay.
Yes.
And he crawled in at 25, 25 words per minute. And so, they bring him in and I look up and I see 25 words per minute. And I said to him, hey, George, help me understand here. Your resume says you type 95 words per minute, and this says 25. Help me understand what's going on. And I'll never forget. He goes, well, let me ask you a question. Are you interviewing me as a typist or as a marketer?
That's already the negotiation. That's it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this is
But
good. I'm
and so
surprised.
how do you end those conversations? Like, okay, well, thank you very much. If you're not going to be truthful, this is not going to work. But you're like, I end it, huh? Because I
Yeah.
think that's that.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
the fact would be, and no mean spirited whatsoever, but I think you're both sitting there a little awkwardly, especially in my situation, which has happened multiple times
mm-hmm,
in this scenario where we have identified that this isn't something that you're able to like communicate. And you provided this information. I didn't say you had to have Six Sigma, but this was an
mm-hmm,
example of like you were providing this. Would
mm-hmm,
it be a fair statement to say that maybe this isn't an accurate depiction of a case study that you did? The
mm.
answer was, "That's true, that's correct."
So
And
you
so I was like, at this point, I don't think that we would move forward.
got it. Okay, so while you're asking them, let's say you really want a company hires you and say, look, we have too much turnover. We
Mhm.
really need people who are going to stay with us, who want a career, who are not just looking to clock in and out. So what systems do you put in place to interview? Like, what do you do for the interview process to look for that? So specifically, because I'm sure there are a lot of people listening and saying, we have 20 employees, but we need a few more leaders. But we don't. It pains us when someone comes and leaves in 6 to 12 months because we have to train them and then we lose them. How do we get someone that's going to stay for 3, 4, 5 years? And what do you look for? What are the interview questions? How do you figure that out? Because no one's going to say, like you said earlier, "Oh, you caught me. Yeah, I'm not here
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
career.
I'm not gonna
I,
show.
yeah, yeah, or I'm just here for 6 months until I get the job I really need." So how do you figure that out if that's the problem?
Well, to some degree, you're never gonna get away from that because it's gonna be people that are openly applying, thinking, "Oh," you know what I mean? Like, "This would be good." What I tell our clients is we're gonna be as specific as possible, but we also have to outline what your value adds are. Like, what differentiates you from anybody else, from any other organization? So, is it benefits on day one? Is it a 401? Adoption leave? Any type of benefits we will outline. And I'm coming full circle, but part of the interview process really has to focus on, and the interviewer or myself would have to invest time to say, like, what is the reason that you would like this position?
Mm,
Uh, Usually the first answer, no doubt, is, well, I'm really interested because, and it's whatever they've read on a website,
mhm.
right? But you have to spend the time on that one to dig a little deeper to say, okay, like, well, they have all these benefits. Like, are you interested? Like, which ones are you interested in? If the answer you come is, well, all of them, you can kind of get the idea that they're not looking for anything specific within this company. They're looking for any company.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and then
So,
multiple interviews. And I think when I said this before to you, like panel interviews, just disorganized panel interviews are crazy and leave a really bad taste in folks' mouth because you're basically saying, okay, there's going to be five of us in a row. And you're going to sit in front of a squad of folks, and we've separated questions from each other, and we're not making it as personal experience as we possibly could. Like, that's how much we care
mm,
about this. So we're
right.
saving our time, and your time technically is kind of the sell with it. But
Hmm.
just imagine yourself in a situation, you sit down in front of a panel of, quote unquote interviewers, and they're just looking at your reaction, but it's asking the same questions. That can
Yeah,
happen between like three or four people on one-on-one interviews. That's when you really get to spend more time digging into answers with questions.
right.
It's not, there might be something that they decide to share with you one-on-one versus five people in a row.
Right, right. No, you're right.
So it's I would say the time investment is a huge piece of it. Uh,
Yeah.
and then for folks that, because this is everyone, I think that, nobody ever calls us and says, I just like people that might not show up on the third day. You know what I mean? Or do this. But I think we're very honest when you're sourcing for candidates, when you're going through the
Right.
job description, even a first preliminary conversation to say, I'm going to give you a little bit more details about the job. Is it something that you think you would be interested in? If you ask a yes or no question, you're going to get a yes or no answer. So
So
you have
open-ended.
to, yeah, make it more open-ended so they can actually explain to you where their interest lies. And you will get, and I mean, there's a huge amount of research of what is the driver for folks to take different positions. Like, right? So it's, do they want a short-term position? Do they want to be a consultant? That's a whole different track. Will somebody take a temporary position? A lot of times, no. Sometimes they won't because it hasn't been explained to them what the benefit could be. So I think you really have to go through what the benefits are that separate you from another company. And then when you're interviewing folks, it is open-ended questions where they can elaborate on their answers.
Right. Don't give them yes or no, and let them. How do you get them to elaborate but be off script? In other words,
That's a good
like
question.
I'm gonna throw my anecdote, but you're the Michael Jordan of this. One of the things that we do to kind of get them off script as possible, as little as possible, as much as possible, is first thing we go through their job history, and one by one just say, oh, so why are you thinking of leaving your current job? Or if they've already left, why did you leave the job? And then then go to the next one. Why'd you leave that job for that job? And why'd you leave this job for that job? And I think questions like that, which I don't know if it's that common, because when I ask it or we ask it, it seems like people aren't often ready for people to ask them why they left all their position. And they'll do like, well, this company, I got laid off because they lost a big contract. This company, there was an accounting issue and they lost this, and this company downsized because they lost this customer, and occasionally like, oh, I didn't like the culture there, or I got $2 more an hour at this next place,
Hmm.
and on a. But tell me how you do that. Do
Yeah.
you go through why they left each position?
So I will say kind of the intention behind multiple interviews, if it's done right. This is kind of a good segue for that topic too, because there's folks that will focus on a timeline very specifically, like what you're talking about, where it's like, oh, I see that you worked for insert company for 5 years, and when you say, tell me about your time there, like what was the transition like? Yes, but I am a fan of taking smaller details because it's the resume. So it's whatever they're selling. It's
Right,
whatever I'm selling to you or they're selling to me.
right.
It's taking smaller details off a resume. And we might have just gone through a very specific timeline or section, but they might be part of a Society for Human Resource Management group. They might have included, of course, what
Mm,
college they went to, if that's on there. If they do volunteer organizations, people will include charities. So I will take something from that realm versus a
uh-huh.
job and ask them kind of in
Oh,
in a nonlinear fashion all of a sudden, because I can read where they worked,
right,
right? You know what I mean? Like, what are they going to tell me unless I ask some very specific open-ended questions, which
right.
we can. But if you were in the marching band, how was the marching band? Like, what did you enjoy most about being in the marching band?
Yeah, yeah,
And you will tell
yeah.
how that throws people off. But then I think like they're like, oh, I get it. Like, wait, okay, so stop, change, start. Now I'm going to have to discuss something that I don't think anybody's ever asked me about since I
Right.
was in
Or
college. Yeah.
I think you know what? If anyone's watching and they're wanting to know how to change up their interviews, I think you hit the nail on the head. We call like putting the person on tilt a little,
Hmm.
giving them something they weren't expecting, not in a bad way, not even in a gotcha way, but just so they can get off the script,
Yes.
because they've got the script, you've got the script, we're an amazing company, you should see. And to get him off the script, and ask him about the marching band, and have him go into detail. And I think it's when you do stuff like that, sometimes you find out how wonderful they are, and oh my gosh, this person has a great heart and committed and
Yes.
whatever. Yeah.
Well, and you can tell when somebody is describing something that it's obviously an experience that they enjoyed. And I think you get a little bit more insight into that person as a person versus the one that's sitting in front of you that you're reading their
Hmm.
resume. And I think folks have been told forever to make sure you role play before you go in. And I
Hmm.
feel bad for
Hmm.
the newer, the younger generation because, it's adorable. I think where some it's like, "Oh, shake hands, look an eye." Like you can see them kind of like ticking it off and they're so
Hmm.
nervous. I'm like, "Well, I think they're just gonna describe whatever is specifically written on this resume because they think like, that's what they're supposed to do."
Right. Right.
Or and
So,
that usually for those guys, I'll say, like, "Tell me about your last day of college. Like, what did you
right.
do? Did you have
Wow.
exams? Did you skip it?" You know? Like, "Did you go home to your parents, or did you live somewhere else afterward?" Or tell me something like that just to get, I'd say, a little bit more comfortable because it's fair that people can be a horrible interview, but could
Right.
still be a right fit for the job.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that okay. So let's reverse engineer this because, by the way, I think that was amazing. I think, getting people to get off the script can show you how wonderful they are and how great they are, and things that you would never ever find out in the interview if you just went through the process. And by the way, just to kind of add to that, sometimes when I have a junior person doing interviews, like someone in our company that hasn't done a lot of interviews, you
Mhm.
know but we're trying to get them started. So okay, go ahead, you do the interview, and they come back, and I'm like, okay, tell me about the guy, and they'll start telling me. I'm like, hold on a second, everything you're telling me is on the resume. Tell me, the job of the interview is to find out what's not on the resume. So all I
Mhm.
want to hear about is what did you find out that wasn't on the resume, and I think that's a great starting point. You tell me to say, look, when that thing is, imagine you have to debrief your boss on that interview.
Very true.
What do you want to do? You want to just say, well, he's got this degree, he's got this, he worked at these three companies. Well, I would have known that just from looking at this. So I think what we're saying is, ask those questions and find out the stuff. And it could be good and it can be bad. It can be
Yes.
that they're doing charity work, that they're committed, that the last job that they blew it out of the water, and or it can be, they have this massive Amazon business out of their garage, and that's the main focus of their lives. And do you want to know that?
Yes, well, and you can say
Yeah.
it's a fair question, like discussing your hobbies, like you want to be HR appropriate, and I get it. If you put that down, and I think folks think, it's not wrong, where they're like, nobody's going to look at where I graduated college, if I
Hmm.
did, or high school, or where I lived, if I lived somewhere in an area that was kind of remote, or if it was a metro city, or there's a lot of
Yeah.
times I'll say like, how was living in Chicago? How is
Mm.
that? Or just, and I would say create some kind of personalized story where you guys can connect. I mean, and frankly, a lot of times I'm like, "Are you tired of interviewing yet?" And I think that folks are a little taken aback with it because, of course, nobody's ever gonna say to the interviewer like, "Yes." But they'll get there, or at least it'll, I'd say, unshake their nerves a little bit, where I'm like, "Don't worry, like, we're gonna be doing more of an informal
Sure.
interview." I'm
Yeah.
actually gonna be doing a lot of talking myself, because I know that it is a sales, I mean, on both sides.
Yes. Hmm.
And I love usually making the statement, which I think I've done probably for the past 10 years at least, where it's, if you have any questions, there has to be some that you probably weren't comfortable asking somewhere before.
Oh.
Just please ask the question. And they usually folks will say, of course, no, okay. But I will get more questions emailed to me or a phone call later, actually, after they've actually thought about it. Because if they've
Wow.
gone through multiple interviews, they'll think, "All right, well, this person maybe one of my coworkers said things one way, and it wasn't the way that another one said it." So
And
I do get a lot of callbacks with actual questions.
really,
I
because
do.
they feel like you're open to it, and that's
Yes.
great advice. That's
Yeah.
great. So let's move on to actually making the offer. And
Mhm.
this I find is a little tricky, because okay, you like the person, you actually have the authority. It's the fourth interview. Everyone said, yeah, if you like her, bring her on board, or if you like him, bring him on board. Um, and okay, the thing is going well. You're like, yeah, I think I want to offer this person the position.
Mhm.
How do you have a strategy for doing that? And I think, just kind of tell you where I'm going with this. I have seen, a lot of companies and people that they offer someone a position, and they're like, oh, okay, well, that's great. Well, let me think about it, and I'll get back to you. I have this one other interview, or got to talk to my significant other, or whatever. And I never like to be in that position. So you know, so tell me how you do it, and maybe I'll share a little bit about what we've done to address that. But okay, what is the best way to offer someone a job?
So I think one, and this kind of it's Captain Obvious, but by the time you're making that offer and you've had interviews with multiple people, you've gone through everyone's feedback. So you probably get a sense of what's most important to that person. And
Hmm.
you spend the amount of appropriate time with them actually explaining the offer. Because really what you're saying is like, we're going to make this offer. Here's 1,000 things of paperwork, that you're going to sign. I, of course, exaggerate, but like you're going to go through, these are the next steps. And to your point, well, I'm going to need to think about it. If we're making the offer, you can put an expiration date on what that timeline is.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's very fair to say, like, we will need a response within 72 hours.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if that's not something that we can commit to, like, we absolutely appreciate it, we understand, but it's reasonable. You're a business. You're
Hmm.
not in a relationship yet. We've basically just
Right.
said, "Will you marry me?"
Right.
And they're saying, "Let me think about it." You know?
Yeah,
So,
that.
and we're like,
Yeah.
"Okay," but, like, it's not I'm not gonna give you an unresolved amount of time for you to be able to do that,
Right.
because
Right.
then
Right.
if the answer is no, I'm moving on.
Right.
Right,
Right. Right.
so but
Right.
I do think where I've seen we've been more creative if the way that we make the offer, and I will say just a smaller tips, if someone is very interested in a certain type of hobby, or they have a favorite sports team, or there's something to that effect, we will kind of pepper some of the process with, I'm a huge fan of, Cameo. It's a site that you can, book, I would say, celebrities to just give shout out a message.
Uh-huh.
So, if it's Brett Favre or somebody else, and they'll be able to come in and say, like, "And they would like to make you this offer." I think is a good kind of, I would say, shtick, but it makes it positive from the beginning. But as
Mm.
as far as time-wise, if you've already done this dance and you've been engaged in the process with all these interviews and you get to the point of making that offer and the responses they have to think about, which is completely fair,
Hmm.
1,000% fair, uh, but you have to look and say, is there anything that we did with the process leading up to it that
Hmm.
makes them wanna think about it now? Is there
Hmm.
anything we could have done differently? And if
Hmm.
that person doesn't have any questions and you feel that you were confident in kind of what's been displayed, then it's a competing offer, okay? And if it's depending on what's important to them, they should be able to make the timeline. I mean, 3
Right.
days, 72 hours,
Right.
depending, and, like, if it's I mean, there's some very extreme, I would say, scenarios where that doesn't apply, but I think to most it does.
Yeah, and what I have found is the more essential that person is, the more leadership they're going to be. The I want to think about it is almost like a deal killer because again, if they're just going to be a cog in the wheel, fine, think about it,
Agreed.
72. But if they're going to be Megan's assistant at Integrity,
Mhm.
Solutions, that's not an I want to think about it kind of thing. So and I want people to think about that. You're hiring an assistant, and they say, "Oh, Megan, thank you very much. Let me. I got two more interviews. I got one tomorrow. I got one Friday. Can I get back to you Monday?" But before you answer that, we came with a workaround, and I want to get your opinion on this workaround. So,
Mhm.
what we do when it's a central person like Megan's,
Yep.
right hand person, we make every offer. If we did, would you? So we make it so we said
The
so
hypothetical offer. Yeah.
it's a hypothetical. So let me
Yeah.
ask you a question, Megan. If you've learned all about us, but let me ask you a question. But first of all, we ask them about other interviews ahead of that. So I like say, well, someone of your caliber, where are you in the interview process? Are you doing more interviews? Because I think you should see what's out there, and we want them to see what's out there. And then
Mhm.
say, but if we offered you a position, is this something you would be more than likely to move forward with? And sometimes you go, oh my gosh, I start tomorrow. They'll actually spit it out
Right.
versus that. Well, I do have two more interviews, and then you can like kind of not give the offer and say, well, why don't we talk after you more? But go ahead, tell me if we're crazy for doing that.
I don't think you're crazy. I think what folks kind of need to get okay with is when somebody says, "I've had other offers," because the immediate visceral reaction from anyone that is a human being is, "Oh, really? You do?" Okay. Like, well, maybe I shouldn't offer you now. Or like maybe, and you kind of got to objectively and emotionally get past it very quickly.
Okay.
And I say that's why I say give them a timeline. The hypothetical offer, I think it's fine if you want to do it that way. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. And if the
Right.
person still wants to provide that they're interviewing, okay. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I think you'll walk away from the scenario much like a lot of people would, including myself, of I wonder how committed they're going to be.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think
So
and if you're
that's
trying
the
to
ultimate
hire,
question.
if you're hiring for grit, that's already as
Yeah.
that was your term. All right.
Yes.
All right, let's reverse course because I we could talk for days. Oh yeah, talk to me about failures. Okay, you hire someone and you're like, you're hiring Megan's assistant, and you
Yes.
get her, you work with her for a year, and one day, knock knock, Megan, oh, can I talk to you? You know, uh, my cousin has this other thing, and blah 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 blah, blah and I thank you for that opportunity, but I'm leaving. And you're like, well, I just spent a year training this person,
Yes.
and I was going to start reaping all the benefits. When you go back and say, is there anything probably in that
Yes.
1 year journey that would have been already telling you
A flag.
that,
Yeah.
yes,
Like, what
go
are some
ahead.
of the flags?
Yes.
I think I've learned an amazing amount of lessons. I don't know if I've changed my actions in all of them, my forward actions, but first, I mean, the truth as it relates to how you described and sold the job. Like, are they really doing that? Like, if
Hmm.
it's my assistant, or if it's regardless of what it is, like, were you true to your part of the word, and to
Hmm.
what you actually committed them to? Uh, this is going to sound so basic, but people don't do this all the time. The one-on-ones with your team members, and every single one on a consistent weekly basis, even if you have 15 minutes to cover because you talked the week before, from a pure engagement standpoint, then I should have known that this person was probably going to be at risk of leaving earlier on within that journey.
Oh.
Like, so you need to nurture and spend the time to be able to do it. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of organizations that are like, well, we'll just get you started and we'll throw you right in, having zero training time or nothing. Like, oh, just go job shadow. That's a
Hmm.
great idea. It's still very common. So yeah, the onboarding experience is just as important as when you made the offer. So if you don't even have basics where it's like, here's your software package, here's your equipment, if you're making things difficult up front, that's their first impression. So we've learned that
Hmm.
time and time again. And the old school, hey, we're gonna have a lunch for them, and three people show up because nobody planned it early enough or don't have the details. Like, you have to build those into the actual training. And I think give them a very good glimpse of what other parts of your organization operate. Like, have them meet with those other departments, and I don't care if it's a role that is an entry level admin, but if they're working within your confines in your
Hmm.
offices, somebody can spare 20 minutes to go talk to the head of finance or the
Hmm.
head of compliance or the head of this, because then they feel more a part of something and they don't just feel like a cog in the wheel. And we've
Wow.
learned forward development. It doesn't need to be the old school, like, where do you see yourself in 3 years? How about five? How about 10? You know, like, nobody knows. Okay. Like, they're like, a lot of companies can't even plan that far ahead. Just the question really is, where do their interests lie? And are you helping them get closer? And even if it has nothing to do with the current job that they're doing, if an admin says to me, I would really like to be a coder. Like, I would like ideally like to go into software. Like, I'm very analytical, which I can probably see, and after meeting with them, but this is eventually what I would like to do, then help them, resource them, because
Right.
that's the part that makes it harder to leave. If I look back, and even when I was younger, and I'd say, like, okay,
Mhm.
like, I didn't have consistent one-on-ones, it would be very much
Mm.
like, all right, well, we finished what we needed to today, so but next week's another week, so I guess we'll just figure it out then. And I didn't take the time at the time to nurture that relationship, because it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone unless it is a true family type of circumstance, or it's a true, like, if a family member is sick, or if they have to leave based off of that. If it's not something like that, then shame on us for not knowing.
Wow. So you're saying life situations aside, how invested you, the
Yes.
company was into the person has a
Correct.
lot to do with that. And I hope everyone who's listening to this hears it loud and clear. The onboarding, the checking in with them,
Yes.
and just nurturing them is all part of enrolling them into your vision of, them, where they're going to be in your company. And
Don't be afraid to ask too, like, and on a scale of 1 to 10, how invested are you, like, in your
Mhm,
job? And, like, where are you with that? And if they give it a 7, then how can I help you become more invested? Like, what can we do?
right.
That's a very easy, straight way to understand where they are, and then you keep track of that answer for the whole time period you're having one-on-ones, and if they decide to leave at the end of a year after you're still investing in them, you
Mhm,
weren't investing in the right areas for them.
right. Okay, so that was an amazing. I hope everyone took that in. We could have a whole podcast on that, how you help people nurture and grow in their organization. You own some of that if they walk away after a year.
True.
But let's take the reverse of it though. Let's say you're becoming convinced they're not a good fit,
Mhm.
and uh and you are picking up, he or she is your
Yeah.
assistant, so you get to work with them every day. You're engaging 10 to 15 times a day, and you're picking up on things. What First of all, let's talk about what is like the most common trait that you see that people are missing who just aren't going to be able to stay long term. I mean, is it drive? Is it uh, being all in? Is it coachability? What are the things that are a marker for failure as you get to spend time with them?
Yeah, I'd say the adaptability to change is a big one for me. And
Mhm,
where folks are unable to actually, even if it's smaller, where it's like, oh, these meetings get moved, where I think like meetings get moved all the time. Like it shouldn't be okay, that big of a deal. The inability to kind of deal with that is a
mhm,
big red flag for me. And then as I said earlier, grit. Like if you're not willing to do things that we've already outlined for you to do because you think it might be too hard is one
mhm,
experience, but I would say, but then ask for help.
mhm,
And so like the silent struggle where it's like, well, you never told me that you needed help. Like we could have found a way to kind of help resource you. And I think it's pretty, I would say, easy-ish to
mhm.
understand when people start to disengage themselves.
Yeah. I mean, for me, often it shows up in having difficulty coaching. I don't know if you've seen that, where you sort
Yes.
of say, "Hey, you know what? I think there was a better way to handle that," or "Hey, you forgot to include this and that," and the defensiveness, and not like, "Oh, I get it. Okay, I'll make sure that doesn't happen again," versus, "Well, no, I really think my way's better," and you're like, "Well, what are we going to do?" What do you do in those situations?
Yeah, I will in my own experience. If you talk to 20 years ago, Megan, if I had like one negative thing that was like said to me, I would be like, this is personal. Like literally just took everything a completely different way. Where now I'm like, tell me if there's
Hey,
something like just
bring
you
it
have to,
on.
yeah,
Yeah,
just tell me what it is. Like, because I'll
yeah.
be able to fix it. Just somebody needs to tell me. And I think if somebody is unable to truly be coached, and I've had a lot of folks be truly unable to be coached, and we could have been doing it in the best way, but you can tell by the first reaction that this isn't going to work, or their immediate go-to is kind of conflictive,
Mhm.
where you're like, "Oh, are we really going to get into an argument about this? Like,
just,
this is
just
not, yeah,
just do it this way. I mean,
yeah,
just fix
like
it.
yeah,
Don't
like,
do.
I'm actually trying to offer help, and I think that you're really actually angry, and
Yeah,
this isn't
yeah.
happening. Um, I mean, we're very, I say, open with our performance management process and open with folks from the beginning of how this is. You probably can tell, I don't like to sugarcoat a lot. So
Mhm.
it's, nobody wants to have these types of conversations. Nobody enjoys them. We don't need to put platitudes in there. I mean, polite and be nice, but it's not one
Mhm.
of those like, okay, I'm going to take you to lunch to tell you that you stink. Like
Mhm.
nobody, it's just so counterintuitive to what you're actually trying to do. But you have to communicate it. Like, but nobody wants to hear it over a salad, and be like, this is not really what it is.
Mhm.
But if folks are not open to that, and you'll be able to tell quickly because they'll make absolutely no change whatsoever,
Mhm.
and they'll
So what do you
continue
do? How do you
performance
how
manage quickly. Yeah,
so
and
talk
stick, and here the other part too, folks are going to be like, well, that's difficult because they know enough that I don't want to lose them.
Hmm.
That should not be the case. Like, then you're exacerbating the issue. You're gonna have more of a problem even if they're doing half of their job.
Hmm.
And you don't need someone that's just a
Okay.
filler. You
Right.
want that someone that wants to be there, and they
Yeah.
clearly have told you that that's not the case. And you have a very honest conversation that's documented to say, "On these times, I went over this with you." Like, by the end, you can tell folks who are disengaged anyway, so the last
Right.
conversation would be like, "Yep, yeah, no, I haven't changed. Well, I tried, but it
Do
didn't work."
you do you think there's a thing where sometimes, the person feels like you need them more than they need you, and once they've made that calculation,
Yes.
the coachability goes down. In other words, how coachable will I be, Megan, if I'm handling your biggest account and
Yes.
something happens to me tomorrow, uh you know maybe you could
Well, yeah,
scramble and
yes.
put the tattered pieces back together. But when someone takes advantage of their position of being theoretically irreplaceable, to then say, okay, well, I'm irreplaceable, so maybe I'm not going to be as coachable. But how do you deal with that?
I would say years and years ago, that was absolutely kind of what, and even with my own thinking, like, if so and so leaves, then what happens? And a gentleman that we used to work with, he would call it this contingency plan. And I don't mean to be flip about it at all, but it was like, what happens if you get by a bus plan? Like, what happens if something absolutely just,
Mm,
you're gone? Like, and the answer usually isn't, and the company won't go on.
right,
And
right,
yeah, I don't mean that in a dry way. So, but I think with the way that people are interacting when they think that, and I don't want to say they're overestimating, their contributions, because I think there absolutely are instances where
yeah.
companies have set it up that way, and it's like, if Susan leaves, like,
Hmm.
are we even going to know the passwords? To the, you know what I mean? I think you have to put
Yeah,
together a strategy to say, like, it's
yeah,
where would we be logistically in some of these
you're right.
instances. uh, but no,
Yeah,
if that is actually truly how the employee is feeling, it's probably best that they no
right,
longer continue with the organization, because
right,
they're probably also having a conversation of like, yeah, and if I left, I would, this is what it would do to him. Like, I would say have them have an open conversation with their boss about it. Like, is
right,
that true? Would it hurt
right,
your company? Like, establish that. And if there's people in it, like, that's the case, then you probably need to come up with a strategic plan if that does happen.
right. And we call that redundancy. Like
Yeah.
if you are having a problem with the 999 accountant in your firm, okay, and you want to have a
Hmm.
conversation, that's not going to be the same conversation as if we have one accountant in your firm and they're not meeting expectation. So
Right.
your ability to have that conversation is almost inversely proportional to how much redundancy you have in your organization.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I
Yes.
mean,
Hmm.
so it actually goes to hiring strategies, and what you're saying with the bus thing is to divide up the work, have redundancies. And I think when, again, if the listeners who are listening, if you're starting a company, obviously, if it's you, your cousin, and your spouse, you have zero redundancy, nothing.
Right.
You're like toast. You need everybody, and hopefully those people won't act out on the fact that they're essential. But as you get to 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, at a certain point you have to now start hiring for redundancy rather than, oh, we need, you may need
Yeah.
two more people in a department just so you can feel comfortable. But has that come up, and have you ever said, we need to, just like you said, find out what the passwords are, and we need
Yes.
more people? But go
Yeah,
ahead, how do you
yeah,
deal with that?
I say that because that's a true to life experience, where it's, oh, okay, well, and I think it really is, what is the intent from the employee? Like, I'm a firm believer. I don't think people are intentionally trying to sabotage, but at some point you're like, is this person really just gonna, I think, say sayonara and that's
Mm-hmm.
it, and just leave, and okay,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
they think there's like some grand parade that will follow, and we're like, this is
yeah,
really gonna do some damage.
Right, right. And yeah, but
you
the
know?
flip side, the flip side of that is, by the way, there are people who are so essential but come to work every day as though they're not. And
Yes.
I think those people are the ones you just want to shower with
Yeah, those are the ones that you wanna
bonuses and
nurture.
yeah,
Yes.
nurture
Like,
and
and
you
those
know,
people, and I think that's a very good point because that's a lesson that we learned, and that's why I'm so kind of stalwart on you should have an engagement with your employees like at least once a week. If they're your direct reports, like, and don't cancel it. Don't be that manager that's like,
wow,
oh, don't like, oh, well, because all you're sending is the message of, well, I have something more important. And
right.
that's not the message you want to be sent. And if you need to move it, do it a couple weeks in advance. If you're like, oh, I'm going to have to go out of town, or I'm going to have to see this client, or I'm going to have to do this, move it with enough notice that the person, you're not canceling it the night before or the morning of. Because at that point, they've probably coming to the table with their own feedback and their own information. Right. But
Mm.
those are the ones that you do want to nurture. And you want to make sure that they know that you're paying attention. That's really what it is.
Well, is this similar to the old adage, people don't quit jobs, they quit their bosses? I mean,
Yep. Yep. They quit their
uh,
manager.
yeah, they
Yep.
quit their manager, they don't quit
Yep.
yeah, the organization. And so what you're saying is, I'm hearing, and you've repeated it in different ways, is to just that constant check-in to make sure that they have everything they need, that there's no misunderstandings, that
Yes.
you value them, and that you appreciate them, and you acknowledge, their commitment and hard work, and that goes a long way. Is there any other things that you have found, and we'll wrap it up pretty quickly. Any other things you have found that allows you to enroll staff into your vision? If again, these are not temp workers,
Mhm.
but
Yep.
what else can you do to enroll them and say, look, we want you to retire here. You've been with the company for 22 years. I
Mhm.
want, if I was your boss, I would say, I want 10 more Megans, who are going to be here for 22 years. And, how anything else we're missing that you could tell people? How do you get that kind of commitment out of
One, I
people?
would say, and even from a startup perspective or a small organization, because I mean, I started and I think we had probably 15 employees right at the time. So it's kind of almost like growing up. But if I want people to stay now, it's really, is the culture a good fit? I don't think anybody woke up saying like, I'm going to do staffing. Like this is really where it's going to be, where it's going to be at. But I think I do a good enough job of explaining potential employees for us of why my day is so different and I never have the same day twice. And that's part of what, honestly keeps me coming back. And my engagement with people, with clients or associates, I know that I'm making an impact on their lives. So if that's something that you are interested in, yes, stay. And I keep going back to this when people are like, what's your 10-year plan? And I'm like, we shouldn't know yet. Like,
Mhm.
we shouldn't know yet. Like,
Right.
I know within the next 3 years, we might have some shorter term goals, but I go over our culture a lot, and nobody's ever been, thought of negatively if they over communicate. And I know it's
Mm.
an obvious one, but what I mean, like, think of it, when's the last time anybody said to you, like, "It's enough. Like, you don't need to tell me anymore." You know what I mean? Like, "I'm good here." Never.
No.
So but what I love to see is the way that our, departments and kind of people within those departments,
Hmm.
have a cross relationship, and that doesn't mean that somebody from finance is doing the work of
Mm.
HR, but really kind of putting events together, and whether that's a town hall, that actually has content that people will like to see and listen to, or touch bases, or even with Zoom, because when everybody went remote, it was like, well, we're all going to get on and we'll provide a lunch for the day. Okay, just order to your house. Like those, you can sense I have a theme, but the engagement parts and with culture, I think are two bigger ones that I would say that we've learned over and
Hmm.
over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's amazing advice. I think people start companies or grow companies, and this whole thing of how to grow a team is taken for granted. I think they think it's like, I know how to deal with people, so I'm just going to hire people and I'll be nice to them, and somehow everything will
Uh,
fall into place, and no processes.
You know what? And this will probably be my last point on this, but this was a
Mm,
big lesson learned. Yeah, hire people smarter than you are. I mean, that is
mm,
a huge and it takes a while to get to that point where I think that you think that people are comfortable with that. But
mm.
if my boss had 22 Megans, he would I don't know if he probably wouldn't agree with that statement at all whatsoever. But we hire people that are just much smarter at doing things
Yeah,
that are not there is certain amount to be said for a jack of all trades,
yeah,
but with specialties, like I'm
right,
not your person that's going to develop our new software,
right.
but and to recognize that and not have it feel like it's being pulled away from somebody, but it's just like if you have 20 me's, like we all will have, the Lord help us, we probably wouldn't get any invoice and billing done. Like, I don't wanna do that, So just hire
Right.
smarter people around you, even if you think like, "Ah, well, gosh, they're smart," and I'm like, because
Yeah.
eventually they're the best,
Right, right.
right?
Well,
So,
you know what? You gotta do that, and then you got to get out of their way, right?
yes,
I mean, just get out of there. You know, if they really are the real deal, hire smarter people, get out of their way, let
don't
them do what they
micromanage them so much. Yeah.
don't like.
Mhm.
Yeah, obviously, initially, whatever to get into the business, but beyond that, just let them fly. All right, listen. So, Megan, I know you have your own podcast. If people want to
Yes.
get a hold of you, listen to tell us about your podcast, how people
Yes.
can get a hold of you, and want to
Yep.
learn more about what you do.
So it's called HR Liftoff. It's not about everything HR, but we are able to talk about some interesting topics, whatever podcast platform that you listen to, if it's Apple, if it's Spotify, if it's other, you can just search for it. Uh, and then I think usually I kind of end with my email. I could do that, but it's
Go
Megan,
ahead.
Megan at integritystaffing.com.
And
If anybody has any feedback.
we'll put all that in the links below, all your contact information, your podcast.
Perfect.
But thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for helping us launch this crash course for CEOs or people who are starting companies. It was amazing content. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy. By the way, if you guys like this, please subscribe, leave comments for me, Megan. We're
Yes.
more than happy to interact with you, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and I'll provide all those links down below. Thank you, Megan. Really appreciate it. You were an amazing guest, and you spent a lot of time with us, more than we had planned. And thank you for being so nice. I really
Thank you for
appreciate it.
having me. It
All
was a
right,
pleasure.
take care.